Before I get started, I'd like to kindly ask that you hit the like button, and please subscribe to the channel for more content just like this.
All I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.
So I'm going to be honest with you. Over the past few years, I've been experiencing superhero movie fatigue. In fact, I'd take it a step further and say it's straight up exhaustion. I just don't find these movies all that interesting anymore, and frankly, I just think there's too many of them.
Move this man!
That being said, there will always be a handful of characters that end up pulling me back in from time to time. And Spider-Man is one of those characters. I've said many times that Batman is my favorite superhero, but for all intents and purposes, Spider-Man could very well be number 2. I just have too much of a deep-rooted connection with the character to completely write him off. From the comics to the 90s cartoon to the Raimi films, this character has always been a part of my life. However, I have been very critical of Tom Holland's version of the character, and in my opinion, rightfully so. I just don't think that his movies did him any favors. And yes, that means I did not care for Homecoming or Far From Home.
Fuck me, right?
Because in my opinion, in those movies, they strayed a little bit too far away from the character that I know. This version of Spider-Man has taken a very unconventional path to get to this point. And that path has just not worked for me as a Spider-Man fan. So that brings me to the third solo movie from Tom Holland's Spider-Man. And again, I have to use the term solo loosely. To be clear, this movie will be very difficult to review without spoilers, but I'm going to do it anyway. So since the trailers were released for this movie, I have made it very clear that the entire premise of this movie feels like cheap nostalgia bait to me. And a part of me still does feel that way. I do feel like at least part of the reason for this movie existing is because they didn't do a good enough job setting up Tom Holland's solo world. So they bring in recognizable and established characters from other Spider-Man movies to kind of just make up for lost time.
Because it's all part of the plan.
It basically felt like they were trying to fast-track a Sinister Six movie. To me, Spider-Man No Way Home is the very definition of a theme park ride movie. It's designed to give you those same types of thrills and excitement that you get from riding a roller coaster. And the whole goal of the movie is to incite a nostalgic reaction. And again, being honest, in those aspects, this movie does actually succeed.
No shit.
I did get goosebumps watching certain scenes in this movie. I just couldn't help it. They show you things in this movie that a lot of fans have waited a long time to see. My biggest concern going into this was that they wouldn't treat returning characters with any level of respect. All in an effort to make Tom Holland look superior, which is something they do a lot in modern movies. And I am man enough to admit that I was mostly wrong about that assumption. In fact, they do follow through quite nicely, albeit in a very limited amount of time, with some of the stories that were established in previous Spider-Man franchises. And they even managed to give certain characters some level of closure.
Why do you cry?
Again, it's really hard to not spoil anything and talk about these things, but it's necessary. Let's just say I was pleasantly surprised to see certain characters handled with respect. And honestly, those parts were some of the best parts of the whole movie. I guess you could say they handled the fan service aspect of this movie quite well. The other aspect of this movie that I criticized before its release was the plot in which all of this is made possible. As a Spider-Man fan, I could not fathom a situation where Peter Parker would approach Doctor Strange and ask him to wipe everyone's mind out, just to make his life easier. And the people around him, of course.
I'm having trouble.
I still don't necessarily think that's a very Spider-Man thing to do. But I will say this. The threat presented in this movie is 100% Peter Parker's fault. And he actually manages to double down and make it worse throughout the course of the film. And it's for mostly selfish reasons. But as a result of all that, Peter does experience very dire consequences. And he finally experiences some level of character growth because of it. It's not Shakespeare, but I did appreciate the attempt to make me give a shit about a character that I just have not connected with at all.
I don't care!
I also feel like this movie is very aware of all the criticisms that have been lobbied against this version of the character. And it does feel like they're trying to actively fix some of those problems that made him feel like less of a Spider-Man. Is it too little too late? I'll leave that up to you. But I personally do wish that they covered some of this ground in earlier films. After 2 solo films and 3 team-up movies, this version of Peter Parker shouldn't be finding himself in what is now his 6th appearance on film. All of that has just been severely mismanaged, in my opinion.
The dreaded stinks!
I think the big catch with this movie is where do things go from here? By the end of No Way Home, he does feel more like Spider-Man than he ever has. And that should mean a lot coming from me. But the thing is that the next time he plays this character, he won't have the same cameos and references to fall back on anymore. So I guess the real question is, can Tom Holland continue his momentum that he builds in this movie and finally carry his own movie? That remains to be seen.
I want to ask you a bunch of questions, and I want to have them answered immediately.
I do think his character benefits the further he is removed from the MCU. And this film does finally set up the idea that he is on his own now, as Spider-Man should be. So maybe I'll get my wish, but we'll see. As far as the negatives go, the typical pitfalls that do plague MCU movies are still present here. You still get an overabundance of comedy, you still get a CGI fest for the third act. There are times when I see a scene or a moment that just doesn't need to exist, and it's clearly just there to try to keep people's attention. In fact, I would love to see a cut of this movie that removes all the bits, all the shtick, all the goofy comedy, and allows the story to not be hindered by those things.
Anybody care about what I want?
I do.
Shut up. Get out.
Because that really is the biggest thing that holds most MCU movies back for me. I will give them a little bit more credit for one thing. On more than one occasion in this movie, believe it or not, they allowed a dramatic scene to play out and gave an appropriate amount of time to let that scene resonate. This was yet another pleasant surprise, since they are usually compelled to break up tension with awkward comedy.
Had you ever heard of the healing power of laughter?
Overall, I did find some enjoyment in Spider-Man No Way Home. I'm just as surprised as you are. It did feel like it was more the product of Sony and had less Disney involvement. This movie will incite nostalgic reactions. It manages to at least attempt to fix Tom Holland's Spider-Man issues. Now, whether they follow through on that remains to be seen. It does have some of the usual MCU issues. And one final note, there wasn't that one pivotal fight scene or action sequence that sticks with you after you watch the movie, similar to the way that the train sequence does in Spider-Man 2. I just don't feel like this Spider-Man has had that moment yet. This is nowhere near the best Spider-Man movie, but it's far removed from being the worst also. It's a flawed but fun popcorn movie, and that's why I'm going to give it the Cathouse.
Saved by kitty litter.
So have you seen Spider-Man No Way Home? If you have, let me know what you thought about it in the comments down below. As always, please like, comment, share, subscribe to the channel, hit that bell for notifications, and I'll see you next time right here on Real Shift. Thanks for watching. Peace out.
Y'all be cool. Right on.